Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Whether you're a pastor, church leader, or a passionate member of your faith community, this podcast is designed to challenge, inspire, and equip you with the tools you need for impactful ministry. And now for a little bit about the guest for this episode. Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today, Martha Tatarnic welcomes Margo Guernsey to the show. Margo is a documentary director, producer, impact strategist, and founder of Time Travel Productions. Her films include Councilwoman, No Time to Fail, The Officials, and The Philadelphia 11. Prior to film, Margo worked as a union organizer, nonprofit development director, and Spanish-English translator. Margo's work has received support from Chicken and Egg Pictures, ITVS, Catapult Film Fund, Good Pitch, Perspective Fund, Ford Foundation, Cerna Foundation, and LEF Moving Images Fund, among others. And she was a Film Independent Fast Track Fellow. She speaks both Spanish and English and holds an MFA in film from the University of Miami, an MA in history from UMass Amherst, and a BA in history from Brown University. Margo teaches producing as affiliated faculty at Emerson College and is a member of the Documentary Producers Alliance and Global Impact Producers Alliance. A reminder before we start today's conversation, please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and share Future Christian with a friend. You can connect with Martha, Lauren, and Future Christian on Instagram. You can send us an email, lauren@resonatemediapro.com, with comments, questions, or ideas for future episodes. We appreciate your voice and how we faithfully discern the future of the church.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. I'm your host for today's episode, Martha Tatarnic, and I'm really thrilled today to be joined by Margo Guernsey, who is the producer and director of the really important film, The Philadelphia 11. Welcome, Margo.
Hi, Martha. It's really, really a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, I'm so looking forward to our conversation. Obviously, I want to dig into the documentary and talk all about that, but we always begin our podcasts with a few opening questions just to set the stage and help our listeners get to know you a little bit. So maybe, Margo, you can just share with us a bit about your faith journey, what it has looked like in the past, and what it looks like now.
Yes, thank you for that question. I often start these talks by saying I am not Episcopalian.
Okay.
Because I made a film about the Episcopal Church and have spent the last 10 years hanging out with some amazing Episcopal priests. But I was raised in a UCC church in Western Massachusetts. And the Episcopal Church across the street had a priest who was a woman. So I was born in 1974, and I had no idea that that was unique, which is another piece of when I found out about this story. It turns out she was one of the first.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
Not one of the original women who are in the film, but in the early 80s, there were only a few women who at that point had been ordained and were serving parishes, and she was one of them. So I learned about that through the making of this film. And it also helped me understand a little bit more about why I was so surprised when I first heard about this story, because I lived in a very small town. So I would have seen her walking around town with her collar.
Yeah.
So I was raised in a UCC church. I spent a long time in my 20s and 30s not going to church and feeling pretty alienated from the structures of institutional church, not feeling like it was a spiritual space for me or a place to connect with God, and just not feeling, not feeling connected. I don't want to say not feeling seen, but just not feeling connected. And when I had kids, this probably happens to a lot of people. I started seeking a little bit more. I just wanted them to have a spiritual grounding in their lives. So I started going back occasionally. but still didn't feel very connected myself. And through the making of this film, have found maybe not answers, but been exploring some questions, and actually have started attending church again locally, not where I grew up, but in the Boston area, a really great parish here locally, where that's very focused on love and liberation and equality for all. And I think working with Episcopal priests that are women for so long helped me see that it's not my faith or my connection to Holy Spirit that was hard, but it was institutions that just didn't, that were patriarchal, to be blunt about it, right? Yeah. Where the even with in a UCC church where the language is about she and he as Holy Spirit, it just, the rules, and it just felt very intellectual and not connected actually to the way I connect with the sacred. And so I'm still on the journey, but making this film, the unexpected gift was to bring me a little bit closer to faith.
Wow, that is really something, because I guess I did just imagine that you might be Episcopalian given what this film is all about. But so interesting that has reignited that journey in that particular way. And I mean, obviously we're going to get all into it and so on, but that idea of normalizing women in leadership, I have a lot of thoughts about that as well. So yeah, excited to talk about that. But before we get into the documentary, is there a spiritual practice that you're finding meaningful right now that is helping on that journey?
My meditation practice is the other way that I've reconnected in this journey. And I think that that's as spiritual. Like I said, I have started attending church on a regular basis, but I would say that both the meditation and the sort of being in church community and worship, have both been.
Yeah. Well, and maybe I can just dig a little bit more too, because obviously, we have a lot of writers and church leaders on the podcast. I don't know that we've had a film director before, so this isn't normally in our opening questions, but can you just share a little bit about your background as somebody who makes documentaries, somebody who makes films? Because it also sounds like that is an avenue of spiritual opening for you as well.
Thank you for that question. I actually didn't start as a filmmaker out of college. I was a union organizer. I was in college. I studied history and what I called community studies. I went to a school that allowed you to put together your own major. So it was political science and sociology really combined. And was a union organizer when I graduated for many years. And that work, while I still believe in it, it was just burning me out. And I could sense that it wasn't spiritual or otherwise supportive, right? It just wasn't, it wasn't a space where I was thriving as a person. And that's what began the journey to filmmaking, which was I won't take you into the weeds, and then ended up, in going back to school and getting an MFA and pivoting over to filmmaking, which the act of storytelling, which the way that we engage in storytelling is a deep storytelling. It's actually, you're exploring the meaning beyond the meaning. So it's the facts of what have happened. In this case, with this film, it's something that happened in the past, but it's also the meaning below that. And what does this mean? What did it mean for the people who participated? And what gave them the courage to do what they did? And so you're really peeling back the layers, to tell the story in a way that's engaging. We say emotionally engaging, but I'm actually starting to say that's engaging so that we see ourselves in these people, like they're human like us, right? So how can we in the present day engage with where they were at 50 years ago in this case? So the act of filmmaking is an act of storytelling, which is really a deep dive into human connection. And I think you're right to say this is, in many ways, it is a spiritual practice. I don't think all filmmakers are as aware of that, and maybe the filmmaking would be stronger if they were. And I think it's something that, I'm coming into also myself. But that was my journey in a nutshell. Well, we'll talk about the journey to this film probably.
Yeah, but you're like, it's certainly not mere reporting. Like, you're not just kind of constructing a journalistic take on like events of the past. And I'm currently completely lost in 16th century Tudor England in the book that I'm reading right now. And so that question of like, okay, so this is the story, but like, why does it matter? And why does it matter for us? I think is front and center. So we've teased this incredible film, The Philadelphia 11, but for those of our listeners who haven't heard about it yet or aren't aware of what this is about, maybe you can start by giving some broad brush strokes of the story.
Right. So for those who don't know, in 1974, after many, many years of lobbying for change in the Episcopal Church so that women could be ordained as priests, a group of women who were ordained as deacons and had gone through all of the training and the discernment process that's required by the church to become a priest, but were told they could not take that final step because of their gender, they got together and decided to move forward and organize a service that would be outside of tradition, outside of expectations, outside of what the church had said was the right way to do things. And the service was held in Philadelphia at the Church of the Advocate. This was a group of white women, and this was the only Episcopal church willing to hold the service. And it's noteworthy, I think, that it was a Black urban church in North Philly. And so the service, and there were 3 bishops who agreed to ordain the women. And so that service was held in 1974, and the film is their journey. It's their story told exclusively by the women, the people in the story, the people who were the women ordained and some of their allies.
Wow. Okay. And then there is also the Washington 4, which gets named a little bit in the film as well.
Yeah. And so that was in 1974. And then part of, as after the ordination, the bishops met and decided and proclaimed that the ordinations were not valid, and the women continued to push forward, and they started celebrating Eucharist both privately and publicly. And then another group of women stepped forward, same situation. They were ordained as deacons. They'd gone through the discernment process, and a church in Washington, D.C. agreed to hold the service, and there were 4 of them. So they're called the Washington 4. And many, many people who were around then and who look back on it now say that was important because it needed to be clear that women weren't going to go away, that you couldn't just sort of erase what happened in Philadelphia in 1974, that this was just going to keep happening. And so the so-called Washington 4 were an important part of that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's lots to dig into here, but why don't you tell us how this project came about from growing up in that small town and seeing that Episcopal priest across the road to making this documentary? How did you come to this project?
I was working on another film. It was in development. It's actually a film that we never made, but I was doing some research and I stumbled on some correspondence with the Reverend Carter Hayward. And I had also recently read Reverend Dr. Pauline Murray's autobiography. So in her autobiography, and for anyone who hasn't read it, it is mesmerizing. It's extremely well written. It's engaging. I highly recommend it.
I need to write that
autobiography, she talks about being in Philadelphia at the service. And I'm not going to try to paraphrase how she talks about it. It's just beautiful. So that was the first I'd heard of it, but it didn't really resonate. And so I always laugh that Carter had so much grace with me because I really didn't do my research before I jumped on that call with her. This was before we were doing video calls. So there was no face-to-face. It was just a voice call. And I didn't know who I was talking to. I did not realize the role that she had played both in organizing and in leadership over all of these decades. And so in asking her the questions that I was asking her, she really had to also tell me her story, and she did it very humbly. And And as I was hearing her talk, it was almost like my moment of a call. I really felt like, wow, I'm really working on the wrong film. This is the film I need and should be working on.
Oh, wow.
And it was another 3 years before we started filming. It was like a quiet call, but then it would just keep coming back to me until I finally let the other one go and moved to this film. And so we started filming in 2015, and yeah, and here we are today. So that is sort of the back and forth of how it happened. But I would also say that the story to me has always been important to tell, because for the same reason that I was shocked that I didn't know and understand it as a student of the civil rights movement and a student of American history in the 20th century. So from the perspective of this is, if you're studying religious history in the United States and you're not being told about this, then why is it being silenced? Like it's critical, right?
Yeah,
so
truly.
And also as somebody it's integral to the civil rights movement in the United States as well. And so it felt like it had been left out. But maybe more importantly, it's also a story for everyone, right? It's not just a story for women who are of a certain faith or who are called to the priesthood. It's really a story about what it means to follow your call, whether that's a call associated with your faith or otherwise, and follow it regardless of whether society tells you you're not eligible. You're not eligible to be who you're called to be, right? It is how to follow that call with grace in a world that might not want you to be who you're called to be.
Yeah.
I think that resonates for a lot of people.
I think that's really important. And I think it's really important to say, like, yeah, it's not just for women. It's not just for women in churches. It's not just for women in leadership. Like the story here is a story that we all need to hear for a whole variety of reasons. And I guess that kind of prompts my next question, because, like, we've just come to the 50th anniversary of that ordination in Philadelphia. That would have been last year. So I can imagine that that feels like a pretty good milestone around which to be releasing the film. But as I was watching it, I was feeling like it was timely in a whole bunch of ways, and I wonder about that kind of call as well, that kind of providential piece of all of this with the film being released now. I have thoughts about it, but I'm interested in your thoughts about why this feels like the time.
We didn't plan for this to be the time. In 2015, when we started filming, the world was different.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the issues we face today definitely existed, but in a different way. And there was no way in 2015 to understand the world in 2025. And we didn't, I will say, I had a couple conversations with Carter early on and said, we're independent filmmakers, which means it could take a while to get this film done. We're really focused on interviewing everybody quickly. Well, since you're all aging, we wanted to make sure we had those interviews. And I remember saying to her, really, we'd love to get done in a few years, but the worst case scenario is going to be the 50th anniversary. And meaning that, like, at least we have 10 years till the 50th anniversary, so we'll definitely make it. So ironically, we actually released the film, the first film festival we screened at was in 2023.
Okay.
But it really did lend itself well to a 2024 celebration of 50 years. So that part maybe was intentional in some subtle ways. But the world that we live in today, with the aspirations of would-be dictators taking away the rights of so many people, there was no way to imagine that. And I do think that some of the lessons for me from this story have to do with solidarity. They succeeded because they knew how to stand in solidarity with each other. And there's some examples of that in the film. But I think often, or not often, but sometimes people with similar views of a just society where folks on the margins have all of the ability to live out full lives, that they're just like everybody else. So there aren't really, a perfect world would be there aren't people on the margins anymore, right? Everybody can live fully in their humanity. but we can fight with each other about what that looks like and how to get there. And we're all human, and it's actually healthy to debate and disagree. But sometimes that splinters a movement, and they knew how to stand in solidarity. There was so much disagreement about whether Philadelphia was even appropriate. Is it appropriate to hold a service that is regarded as outside? I keep saying outside the norms because the women themselves always remind me that there's nothing about church law that they broke, right? There's nothing about theology that was broken, right? In fact, the language in the canon law was gender neutral. And so, but they did break with tradition, and the hierarchy in the church had very clearly told them not to do this. So it was an act of ecclesiastical disobedience in that way. So there was so much disagreement about whether that was appropriate. There was so much disagreement about whether and how women who were not straight should come out, when they might come out. Was it safe? I mean, but they all stood in solidarity in so many ways with each other. Also, at a time when the women's movement wasn't particularly known for standing alongside women of color, and the civil rights movement wasn't known for standing for women's rights, right? It was a time when there was a lot of prioritization of one right. We're going to deal with one injustice now, as opposed to all the injustices. And yet this group stood in solidarity, right? It was Black people and white people standing together for gender equality, with full knowledge, although they weren't public about it. The bishops who ordained them knew that some of the women were gay or queer. So while they weren't public about it, they were very aware. So it was a moment. It was a lesson in solidarity.
Wow. Yeah, that's quite remarkable. And, you noted that it was all white women who were ordained, but that act of the Black church standing up with them is a big part of the story. That's quite amazing. How did they sort of define their participation or their support of it? Like, how did they come to choose to do that?
My understanding is that some of it has to do with trust built over years, which I think is significant for us all to understand. The Bishop DeWitt and the Reverend Suzanne Hyatt. So Bishop DeWitt was one of the ordaining bishops. He was in Pennsylvania. Sue Hyatt was one of the leaders of this group of women. We're very, very good friends and allies of Father Washington, who was the rector at the Church of the Advocate. So they had done a lot of work on racial justice and economic justice in Philly together on other issues. And that is likely to have been a big reason that they could then partner on this. It wasn't a cold call. It wasn't, I don't know you. Could you support this? Right? They trusted each other. Father Washington took it to the congregation and asked the congregation if they were willing to support this, and was clear that he wasn't going to do it without their support. And they, in Bishop Harris's words, overwhelmingly said yes. And Bishop Harris was a member of the congregation. I think she might have been on the vestry.
Oh, right. Yes. Okay.
Yeah. So, but I think, it is about trust built over years, in addition to Father Washington having been a leader in the civil rights movement. He hosted Black Panther gatherings at his church. Again, that movement was not always supportive of gender issues, but that doesn't mean that individuals in the movement were not. And in this case, he was.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's such an important ingredient to note as well when we're sort of considering resistance today. Those pieces around solidarity, but the trust that is needed for that solidarity to happen, sounds like worth bookmarking, just remembering all of that. So you did note that, you wanted to start the interviewing right away. Obviously 50 years ago, people who were involved in those first ordinations would be well into their more elderly years at this point. How many of the 11 were you able to speak to? What surprised you about their stories?
5 of the 11 are essentially the narrators of the film. We were also able to interview the Reverend Betty Von Schiess and sadly, and also the Reverend Emily Hewitt. So 2 more. And those interviews, we ended up not using because, they just it was too late in their lives for them to be the storytellers that you need in film.
Oh, okay.
So it was just an issue of age. So 5 of the women are the storytellers. And, at the beginning of the process, I think it was the Reverend Merrill Bittner who said, we're all so different. Or maybe someone else said it. I think they all have told us that over the year.
Yeah.
And the more we were able to meet with them and speak with them and get to know them, the more that resonates. And I think that's also important to lift up. We are all very different. We have lots of things about us that can be different, even if our skin and our gender is the same. And that difference can bring even more powerful collaboration, right?
Mhm.
We can, and being the same isn't as strong as leaning on each other's strengths. And they are very different, and also some of them very conservative, some of them very liberal. They all different upbringings, different goals in life, just very different, and all very powerful and courageous and steadfast in their calls.
Yeah. Yeah. They, that comes across in the film very much, like that, each one of them speaks with such a unique voice. And I like that, note that, being the same, or being different is actually a strength. I want to get into this piece around, disobedience, and that, this had come before General Convention. I think that's the name in the Episcopal Church for the national gathering, where these kinds of decisions are made. And it had been defeated at least a few times at General Convention around the ordination of women. There's some clips of, some of the statements that people have made around why women should not be ordained. Certainly, I've seen this conversation in the Anglican Church of Canada over the years around equal marriage. And there's kind of always a caution that is put out around, we need to act together. We need to be ready together. And we need to honor the bonds of relationship across the institution. And on the other side of things is the argument that no, actually, we need to test the fruits of the Spirit. And if we kind of wait around for everybody to be ready, we're never going to be ready. We're never going to do anything. So how do you interpret that piece of the story, the importance of these 11 and the 3 bishops and the variety of other supporters being willing to take that step out and say, okay, ready or not, here we come?
People are afraid of change. And I think that's a normal human instinct. And there's probably very good evolutionary reasons for us to fear change, especially because it can be destabilizing. I really love the way you just framed this as testing the fruits of the Spirit. I think it's a beautiful way to engage in conversation about why it's important to be willing to evolve, right?
Mm-hmm.
To be willing to engage where the Spirit is taking us, because it will only take us to better places where we can all be more fully ourselves. The hindsight is 2020, and a lot of the conversations about what would have happened had they not moved forward are all just speculation.
Yeah.
I think that it is true. I believe just by watching watching the dynamics of how these conversations unfold, that had they not gone forward, the church would have continued to get more conservative. And we would have a conservative Episcopal church a la, the Southern Baptists in the United States, right? there was no, if we're not willing, as sort of in your words, to test the fruits of the Spirit, if we're not willing to allow these women to follow their call, there's nothing that will make us willing tomorrow. There's nothing that's going to change the next day, right? We need to experience it. And Meryl talks about this a lot, and it's in the film a little bit, but she talks about it a lot when she speaks about her experience in person, that her job, so-called, she never thought her call to the priesthood would be this, but her call became to tell her story, right? She said, people needed to see a woman celebrating communion, and people needed to see me at the altar. Like the embodiment of who I am, people needed to see that. That became my call. And Carter talks about it also, like, who knew that celebrating the Eucharist publicly would end up being my priesthood? Like, that's not why I wanted to get into this, but people needed to experience it to understand it. And so had they not gone forward, people wouldn't have experienced it. And so the trend, it is highly likely that the church would have just gotten very conservative, and then wouldn't have opened up either to equality for those who are, identify as queer and otherwise. So, I think we would have a very different church today.
Yeah. I mean, even for me, like the number of times that I have gone into a church where they haven't had women in leadership before, it doesn't happen so much now, but it certainly happened earlier in my priestly ministry. And I would get these kind of surprised comments either after leading a service or after getting to know me for a couple of months, like, oh, like I was really opposed to this, but like, you're okay, but it is just kind of being opposed to like the unknown. Like we don't know what we don't know. Obviously the proof is in the pudding. In 1976, the General Convention did vote to allow the ordination of women, which I find to be like quite an amazingly short trajectory from this great big step to the church then like getting on board. It comes out a little bit in the film, but I'm really interested in your thoughts on like the price that these women paid, but also the 3 bishops, also the male priests who invited these newly ordained women into their churches to celebrate communion. All of them were operating outside of what the church as a whole said they should be doing. Like, at what cost?
Yeah. The cost was significant. And, the film, the reason we didn't end the film with the 1976 convention is because it felt important for this, both the cost to the women and, if the 2-year turnaround on the one hand feels like, wow, they really got their organizing together and got it down. On the other hand, it's been decades of work for women priests to really follow their call in the church, right? If you talk to anybody who served a parish in the 80s, even getting a parish job was hard.
Yeah.
Maybe still hard in some places. And when it passed General Convention, there was a time we were going to put this in the film, but it got a little bit too in the weeds for a film. But there was also, I don't know if you'd call it a rule or a canon or something, whatever the terminology passed that was, that basically was called the conscience clause. And it allowed a bishop to choose. Really, what was passed was bishops are now permitted to choose to ordain women if it follows their conscience, but they can also choose not to. Yeah. Right. So there were many, many dioceses for a long time where the bishop just said, it's against my conscience. And so no. And then women had to choose to either change dioceses, which, as you can imagine, is you're rooted up from family and community and church community, or not follow their call. And, so that went on for decades. And so the work continues. And so I would say it's been decades of work, which is why it's so relevant that the cost was so extreme. And, the cost, you could look at it today, not so unfamiliar to those who are getting attacked and death threats and whose families have to go into hiding. I mean, a lot of the cost was having to deal with constant threats and constant press calls and being in the public eye when you weren't called to be a public person, right? None of them were called to that kind of public life.
Yeah.
There were some of the early ordinations of women had security at the ordination because of threats. So it was very real and for a long time.
Yeah. The first ordinations of women in the Anglican Church of Canada happened just down the street from where I am right now. And a couple of my friends were servers at that service, and the police were there. Like, the threats were real. What about the men who supported them? Like, did they lose professional credibility, opportunities? Like, did they kind of suffer as allies?
Yeah, they did. The story in the film, the film focuses on two specific male priests who allowed them to celebrate Eucharist in their churches and were then put on trial. And the Reverend Peter Beebe was banished from the church, never allowed back in. He had his priestly orders, forget the term, but like taken from him.
Yeah.
He's no longer an Episcopal priest in the church's eyes. I think in his eyes, he's a priest. And the Reverend Bill Went also was convicted at trial. He was in a diocese that was a little bit more friendly, and his orders weren't taken from him. But they suffered, life. I mean, Peter Beebe ended up with a different career and a different life. It changed everything for him.
Yeah.
And other allies to a lesser extent, they did not go after the Church of the Advocate. There was a risk there that that they might have, but they did not. And the bishops who ordained the women were retired intentionally. So there was less a professional consequence. And, maybe that is why they were willing to do it.
Interesting. That's interesting. Yeah. So enormous costs. I think certainly I and other women in ministry could report a lot of our experiences over the years, a lot of the experiences that have been shared with the women who went before us. And it is ongoing in a significant way. And also the church of 50 years later is quite remarkably different than it was 50 years ago. And I try to keep that in the foreground of my purview, because there's a lot to be grateful for. There's a lot to be grateful for about my 20 years in ministry versus what those first 20 years would have been like. I want to circle back to your experience of growing up with it being quite normal that across the street is this Episcopalian female priest. And certainly I've always lived in an Anglican church where women have been ordained. They've been ordained longer than I've been alive. And so I kind of grew up with that being pretty blissfully normal. I wasn't, as a kid, realizing that this was such a recent fight, that the women that I saw in leadership, were probably paying a significant cost to be there. Whereas, I also grew up in the classical musical world, and I never saw women conductors or heard about women composers. I did grow up in a church where I saw female priests, and that matters. Representation matters. It matters to see that embodied, as you already said. It just goes a significant way in what we imagine is possible. And at the same time, 50 years on the scale of 2,000 years is we're still really early into this journey. So, where do you see the church being different now because of the past 50 years? And where is the change still very much needed?
I think having that representation is also gives us courage, right?
Mhm.
So it's about embodying the change so that we all can become something new, and where it also gives courage and permission to those who might be fearful of taking that step, right? And I think that's another way that it helps the evolution on this journey continue. And not a surprise, right? To figure out that, oh, in fact, God didn't say that only men can, play this role. That was people on earth, right? Like
Yeah.
it's not the Holy Spirit who made that decree. So, learning to sort of walk this path of, right, this is actually about earthly institutions and humanity and less about Holy Spirit. And how as humans do we start to figure that out together? And, and I say that with your paralleled example of classical music, right? Like this is about how humans have organized on earth, but it really has nothing to do with that which is sacred and that which is connected to God. And yet we're still on this journey. And as you say, 50 years is nothing compared to 2000, which is, I think, why it's so hard. It might be that we as individual human beings are not on earth for very long, but we carry with us that which we've learned from our ancestors, and it makes it hard for people to embrace change. I feel like I'm Episcopal adjacent, but I really am not Episcopalian. And so I've heard a lot about where the church is at and where it needs to go through all this work over these years. But I don't feel like I'm the best person to really voice that, because it's not in my lived experience, even though I've been to many Episcopal services at this point. I do think the church is called to have something to say about what's happening in the world now. We're at a yet another pivotal, how do you say that? Moment in, and silence, really isn't an option. And I think that that's starting to happen. It's been slow, but it's starting to.
Yeah. And, maybe that is an important gift of this being relatively recent, that women have been ordained in the church, is that, we're more tuned in to that reality of, the difference that it makes when people stand together and are courageous and speak up rather than being silent. I also just think, and again, I would also draw in that parallel of the fight for equal marriage that has been such a big part of my years in the Anglican Church of Canada, is I want to be part of a church where we know that we're a work in progress. Where we know that, the Holy Spirit isn't done with us yet. That's the kind of church I want to be part of. As I said at the beginning, I've been really down a rabbit hole of that question of why these stories from the past are stories for right now. And the story I've been particularly delving into is the imprint of female leadership on the Anglican Church that we have now from 500 years ago. And I think that there's one way of looking at that, which is to say, well, so what? That's the past. But you said it so beautifully right at the beginning, this isn't just reporting the facts. This is a story about us and us today. Why does this feel like a story that needs to be told? Where is the connection to us today?
I think, for one, is that in a moment where speaking truth to power is critical to our survival, drawing on the courage and the knowledge that our ancestors have had to do the same is incredibly important. we're not in this alone. We've seen this rodeo before. We've seen it in different formats and in different ways, but it's not new to the human experience. And to see that there is really only one answer to stopping it, which is to stand up in solidarity and with courage and to speak the truth. Right. And to draw that strength from those on whose shoulders we walk is incredibly important right now. Yeah. And I also think that, we don't need to repeat the errors of the past. Right? If we don't know there's a famous saying that's along the lines of that, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. If you don't, when you study the history, you're also studying the future. Right. As human beings, I think one of the more fascinating things about studying history is to the extent that I find that I can relate if we're talking about 500 years ago or 2000 years ago. The person I'm feeling connected with might not have had a computer and might have had to grow all of their own food. And yet I still connect in every other way with the love and the hurt and the jealousy and the rage and the anger and the joy, right? We're all still actually human. And so to be able to understand that and then understand where those who have come before us have succeeded and where maybe they've stumbled, and we can build on that, right? Learning about our past helps us build on that, helps us draw strength, draw courage, and helps us understand that even if we don't learn our past is, we are living it. We're living it in our DNA. We're living it in the way our society's organized. We're living it in our traditions. We're living it in our churches. We're living it in how we understand the spirit. Like we're living it, and to understand it only opens our eyes more.
Yeah, that is so beautifully put. We are really good at repeating the mistakes of the past, but we don't have to. Like there's an alternative. And I think that piece around solidarity that you named earlier, to see that as a layered thing, like that we can also draw on solidarity from past stories for the fight of today. Like what an important thing to realize. There's a quote in the film that I just really jumped out at me, which is from Meryl. And she says, "You need to speak the truth, even if your voice shakes." And I love that, vulnerable naming of the legitimate fear that went into this, but also that sense of call and that courage. Who do you hope is going to see this film and feel drawn into that courage and that vulnerability?
Meryl has another one near the end of the film also, where she ends up leaving the church for her own mental health because she just needs a break from being in the public eye. I'm giving away the film, but in her statement of leaving, she calls on everyone not just to talk the talk, but to walk the walk. And don't participate in institutions that don't fully see everyone as human. Those aren't her words; those are mine. But I'm paraphrasing. It's very powerful. I hope that anybody who feels at all like they can draw strength from these stories of the past will see the film. I think that there's a particular interest in these stories amongst women who are clergy or feel called to be clergy, and amongst women of faith, maybe similar to myself, who have felt lost in a patriarchal church and still yearn for that space to worship and space for a deeper spiritual connection. And anybody, I think anybody who finds strength in stories from the past this is a film for you. We have, with the film for many years, have said, in a sort of a more, have said, we want the film to reach a wide audience. And It's kind of a vague way to say, we want people to know the story. We don't want the story to be silenced. We want the story to be part of history. And I've learned that there's so much media out there that it's also important to say, here's the people I think will really benefit from this story.
Yeah, I really co-sign this. Like, I think that it is for a general audience. It isn't just a niche thing. Obviously, there are particular groups who are going to feel like, especially, like it is their lived experience, but this is part of telling the stories that matter. Like, this is part of telling the stories of how we have fought for equality and what that takes and why it matters. So, yeah, I think everybody needs to see this film. And I'm interested to know how it has been received so far. So you're like a couple of years into first film festival releases. What has been the reaction?
I mean, we have been astounded at the number of people who want to host screenings. So when we first released the film, both for strategic reasons to reach this goal of a wider audience, and because I know from experience that watching a film alone in your living room or on your phone is very different from watching in community and then unpacking it together. So from a distribution perspective, if you just kind of put the film out there, then distributors won't take it. So there's a reason to not just kind of like put it online. And I really wanted to encourage folks to gather and watch in community together. So after that first film festival, we launched this community screening tour, and we're close, if not beyond 500 screenings in person, people gathering. And these are the screenings that register. I am sure that DVDs have been passed around and other screenings have happened. But of those who actually officially gone through the process and registered. So that blew my mind. We did not expect the numbers to be that high. Independent filmmakers will tell you, like, often people are like, oh, we had 15 screenings. We had 30. We're like, we're over 500. Sorry.
Wow. Congratulations.
So there's been a lot of interest. And then we did get it onto PBS, as you probably know. It was actually 90% of the market for public television in the United States programmed it between March and now, so in the past 3 months. So it's had very good market coverage in the United States. It's available through good docs for universities and colleges. So it's been a great, great run. And there's still, I think a lot of people who haven't, it's an independent film, so we don't have marketing. So it's not like you're going to hear about it on your TikTok feed. It's just, that's not going to happen, or on a billboard, right? That's the gap. I also teach filmmaking at Emerson College, so I'm often talking about this, but the gap between, there's so many films out there that viewers would love to see, but just don't know about. There's a gap between knowledge of, and this is true of all the films you and I don't know about that we would love to see.
Truly.
So there's big films with huge marketing dollars, and those are the films we know about. And then these kinds of films you have to keep telling a friend about, because there isn't enough, there's no marketing power for us to reach a greater audience except by people telling them. So, I mean, we have social media. We try to do the things you can do, but we can only do so much. So I think there's still a lot of people out there who don't even know the film exists for them to watch it. So hopefully this will help reach a few more.
Yeah. So everybody who's listening, you need to tell a friend about this, but also, like, how can people host a screening? Is that still a thing?
Philadelphia11film.com is our website. And if you click on host a screening, it's absolutely still a thing. We have a sliding scale starting at $25 to make it accessible to all. If $25 isn't even possible, just send us a quick message on Contact Us. We really want as many people as possible to see the film. And it is the format of hosting a screening, although you could host a gathering in your living room with your neighbors. It doesn't need to be, at a local theater or at your church. It can be very informal. We are planning on putting it on a streaming platform eventually. The big streamers don't take these kinds of independent films, so it wouldn't be like Hulu or Netflix. It would be maybe Vimeo or maybe Amazon, although I don't know. I have to decide whether I actually want to put it on Amazon, because we're going to be sending all the people there. So I'm like, do I really want to give this to Amazon? But it will be available to rent pretty cheap as of next year. We just need to wait for PBS requires a 6-month window before that becomes available. So we're still in that 6-month window, and that's the reason it's not up streaming yet. But we're ready to. It's been 2 years, so once that window is over, we will make it available to just rent at home. But in the meantime, please host a screening. It's the best way to watch it. And then you can unpack it together, talk about, talk about the history, talk about what it means today.
Yeah, well, I will definitely say, like, I watched it on my own because I was going to be doing this interview. And the whole time I was watching it, I was thinking, I can't wait to show this at our church. I can't wait to host a screening because I can't wait to have discussion with people after. And it is the kind of film that really lends itself to wanting to talk about it and wanting to talk about it with your community. So I'm really encouraging everyone who's listening to this to click on that button and get a screening together.
Yeah, so Philadelphia11film.com. And I'll tell you the secret, which is just if you click on the forums, they come to my inbox. So I'm pretty good at responding quickly. Any questions you have about how the process works, just drop them there.
Okay, that's awesome. And I'm sure that we'll make sure that those links are in the show notes as well. Well, I'm incredibly grateful to get to talk to you today. We do have some closing questions, but we'll take a quick break and come back for our closing questions. Welcome back to the Future Christian Podcast, and I continue to be with Margo Guernsey, and we're just going to have a quick fire wrap up questions. So, Margo, we always tell our guests that you can take these questions as seriously as you want or as not seriously as you want. They are meant to just kind of be fun questions that we ask all of our guests. So, if you were Pope for the day, what would that 24 hours consist of?
When I first saw this question, I was very intimidated. All of a sudden, I had an aha. I thought, this is not hard. I would change the rules so women could be priests. That is what would happen in the first 24 hours if I were Pope.
Yeah, I love that because, I mean, we know from this story, we know from our experience, we know that those callings are out there. We know that the Holy Spirit is tapping women on the shoulder and they're being roadblocked. So, yeah, that's a great answer. And I'd probably be a little disappointed if that weren't your answer, to be honest, given the subject that we're talking about today. Is there a theologian or historical Christian figure who you'd like to meet, bring back to life, have supper with? Who would it be?
I actually should have thought of this one ahead of time. There are a few whose names elude me. So I'm not sure. I'm going to have to but I would say after spending close to 10 years with Carter Hayward, she should be on your list of theologians who you want to have supper with, because I have learned so much from her writings, from her theology, and from just getting to know her as a personal plus.
Okay. Well, that's a good answer. And I mean, it's somebody that you actually have personal experience with. So that's good too. What will history remember from our current time and place?
I think the jury's out on this. I think history will remember whether we were able to stand together in solidarity to stop a would-be dictator or not. And that's still happening. It's unfolding around us.
Yeah, that word pivotal is descriptive of the time. So we're not quite sure which way it's going to go. What are your hopes for the future of Christianity?
My hope is that the people of the church continue to follow the spiritual call for both a church and a society where everybody truly is able to live their full selves, where we, as I said earlier, where we no longer talk about standing with the marginalized. I mean, Jesus taught us to stand with the marginalized, but maybe there's a world where there don't need to be marginalized people, where we can all just.
Yeah, I think that's the calling. That's where we're supposed to be headed. Where can people find more about you?
If you go to if you go to Philadelphia11film.com, my bio is on there, but my film company website is timetravelproductions.com. And just click through to the founder page about us, and you can read more about me.
Can I ask what project you're working on now, or is that in the works yet?
Yeah, while working on this film, as you know, it took many years, so there were other things going on at the same time. I made 2 different films about election officials in the United States. So, very much behind the scenes, embedded with them. The first film is called No Time to Fail. It's on Amazon if you want to watch it. And it's, we embedded with election officials during the 2020 election behind the scenes. And then the next one is called The Officials, and that one's streaming on time.com. So if you know Time Magazine, it's Time's, their online version. And it is sort of a follow-up sister film, that is with 4 different, election officials in 4 different states in conservative and urban areas. As they prepare for the 2024 election, under attack, right? They're very much under attack, and their integrity is being questioned. And so it's the film is with them as they prepare for the election while their integrity is being questioned. So I've worked on these 2 films that are very much about upholding our civil rights and our civic process, in the United States. And, very much will be tested again in 2026, as your listeners know. I have a couple other projects kind of in very early stages, but so early that it's not that we're not even talking about it. I'm not even really, it's more the development research, trying to figure out where to go next, in alignment with, some of my other, hopes and dreams.
So stay tuned, I guess, is the answer there. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Margo. Thank you for this film. Thank you for for listening to that calling and the Holy Spirit tapping you to do this, because it feels really timely and really important.
I appreciate your time and yet the conversation. And to all the listeners, I appreciate the work you're all doing out there.
We always end with the word of peace. So may God's peace be with you, Margo.
Same to you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is produced by Resonate Media. We love to hear from our listeners with questions, comments, and ideas for future episodes. Visit our website at future-christian.com and find the Connect with Us form at the bottom of the page to get in touch with Martha or Lauren. But before you go, do us a favor. Subscribe to the pod to leave a review. It really helps us get this out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.